Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best macro analysis to help you successfully invest in financial markets. For our latest analysis, visit macrohive.com. Central banks are falling over themselves to hike rates. Australia, Sweden, and India recently hiked rates for the first time in this cycle. In India's case, it was an intra-meeting surprise. And of course, the Fed raised rates by 50 basis points. This is the first 50 hike since the year 2000. And if you remember, back in 2000, it was enough to pop the dot-com bubble. This time, though, the initial market reaction has been very positive, but let's see how long that lasts. To help people understand all of this, we held a special webinar this week where Dominique Dworf-Foucault, Macro Hive's resident US economist, laid out her case that the Fed could actually end up raising rates to 8%. It's clearly a non-consensus take, so make sure to watch the video. We also give our latest monthly asset allocation update, where we cover equities, bonds, commodities, and crypto, and this should help Macro Hive members manage their personal investments in these uncertain times. And again, we have another non-consensus take in that regard, which is that in inflation environments like today, cash is actually king. And on crypto, this week, our focus has been on metaverse, and we look at how metaverse coins are holding up against other crypto markets. To get access to all of these insights, simply become a member at macrohive.com. With membership, you get access to all of our updates, webinars, transcripts, and our member Slack room, where you can interact with the Macro Hive research team and other members all hours of the day. Membership to Macro Hive costs the same as a few weekly cappuccinos, so go to macrohive.com to sign up now. And if you're a professional or institutional investor, we have a more high-octane product that features all of my and the Macro Hive research team's views, our model portfolios, trade ideas, machine learning models, and much, much more. Hit me up at Bloomberg or email me at bilal@macrohive.com to find out more. Now, a word from the sponsors of this episode, Masterworks. Are you worried about inflation? Perhaps you should be. Every month, inflation is reaching new highs, 6.2%, 6.5%, and most recently, 7.2% in the US. That's how much more food, electricity, and housing is costing these days. And if you're anything like us, now may be time to consider alternatives. Why alternatives? Well, for starters, a survey last year conducted by Motley Fool revealed that ultra-high net worth investors had 50% of their portfolio in alternatives on average. We're talking about portfolios valued at over $1 billion. But one alternative that nobody seems to be talking about is fine art. That's because up until now, you've had to have millions to own fine art. But that's not the case anymore. Thanks to Masterworks, they let you purchase shares that represent an investment in famous artworks, pieces from masters like Warhol and Banksy at a more approachable price point. You can go to masterworks.io/macro to skip the line and join over 300,000 members already on Masterworks. That's masterworks.io/macro. See important Regulation A disclosures and the offering circular at masterworks.io at masterworks.io/about/disclosure. Now, on to this episode's guest, Ukrainian economist Tymofiy Mylovanov. Tymofiy is the president of the Kyiv School of Economics. He's an advisor to the Zelensky administration and former Ukrainian economy minister. We had a hard-hitting conversation, and I'm sure you will all learn a huge amount about the Russia-Ukraine war and what it means for the world. Now, onto the podcast. So welcome, Tymofiy, to this podcast. I have to say, this is the first time I've had a guest who is in a war zone. And so it's quite a tragic backdrop that we're having this podcast discussion. So first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to join our show.
Thank you. And hopefully it will be your last time because we will not have any more wars. But this, I think, is wishful thinking.
Yeah. And right now I can see, I think you're in a hotel room. I mean, where are you at the moment?
I'm in Ukraine. I'm traveling on a number of, I run the Kyiv School of Economics, and a part of the effort to help, defend Ukraine, our foundation, which in peaceful times raises money for education and science, now is raising money for humanitarian relief and all kinds of needed supplies. And so it's a pretty big effort. We raised over $23 million now already. And so I have to travel to secure supplies, talk to donors, and ensure a number of other logistical things.
Okay. No, that's great. Great to know. We'll talk a bit more about some of those things, but perhaps later on in our discussion. Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I always like to ask my guests something about their background, so our listeners understand who you are. So it'd be good to learn, what did you study at university? Where, what did you go on to do? And how did you end up where you are right now in terms of your professional role?
So, multiple high schools and schools in Kyiv, all of them, physics and mathematics emphasis, as many of Ukrainian scientists and scholars came from this type of Soviet schools. I graduated in the year when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was quite a cultural revelation. And I think there are some parallels to be made with what Russian population or Russians are thinking right now about the world. And that's the type of, I was in some kind of cultural denial or dismissal. And that year was formative for me and helped me become almost cynical about the world. And it hurt me quite a bit. But at the same time, I have become very critical and skeptical about everything I learned. I've learned that everything I've been told in the school for my 16 years, everything was a lie. The world was different. It works different. So then I studied in an engineering school in Kyiv, but a management engineering degree. Then I went to the Kyiv School of Economics. Actually, at that time, it was just a master program in Kyiv Mohila Academy. Then Wisconsin PhD in econ, almost random because there was a emergent markets crisis in 1998. That's when I got kicked out from didn't get kicked out, but pushed, kind of salaries went down in an investment bank I was working for as a director of the back office. Actually, Alpha Bank, the Freedman Bank in Ukraine, which is now is being sanctioned around the world because of their connection with Russia. And so then, and I didn't know what to do. So I went to the US to start, to try it out. My PhD, and then got stuck there for 20 years in academia. Went to Bonn, to Germany for 4 years, published a bit, went back to the US, Penn State, then University of Pennsylvania. Was very enlightening experience for me, that Ivy League place. Pittsburgh, 2014, Revolution of Dignity, people dying, Crimea annexation, Russia invades the east of Ukraine. So I get engaged with Ukraine, build a think tank, and then a couple of years later, I get appointed to the board of the supervisory board or the council of the National Bank of Ukraine as an economist. And I'm appointed as the president of the Kyiv School of Economics. I'm developing it for several years. Then Zelensky comes to power. I get invited by his prime minister, Alexei Honcharuk, to join as the minister of economy. Resigned from the central bank position, become a minister. It was a short-lived tenure, but I managed to do the land market reform in Ukraine. There's after 20 years moratorium on sales of land, and that cost me almost a political career because everyone attacked me for that, kind of vested interest. So I had enough of that, resign, don't join the next government, even though there was an offer to continue. Come back to the KEC, to the Kyiv School of Economics, develop it even more. Move it to a fully fledged university, open a bachelor program now. And then I get appointed as an advisor back to the administration of Zelensky, and also as this chair of the supervisory board of the Ukrainian Defense Industry Consortium of state-owned enterprises, which have worked in producing military stuff. And these are my current positions. And I still hold the University of Pittsburgh professorship. So I teach there, and I don't know,
Okay.
So that's the professional career, real quick.
Yeah. No. Okay. You've done lots of different things, academia, policy as well. But obviously, there's something larger going on at the moment with the Russia invasion or attack on Ukraine. And so in the West, so I'm based in London. I consume the media here, and we hear stories about bombings everywhere. There's this. There's a lot of prominence around the Mariupol attacks, in particular. Given the strategic importance of it. So. What we're seeing over here in the West is, these stories of bombings and so on. But then it kind of subsides to the background. I'm in financial markets, and when I look at the behavior of financial markets, they've kind of started to move on from the war. And so one isn't quite sure of of like where we are in the war exactly. So it'd be useful if you could just give us some context of, where are we? What's the situation like at the moment? How far has Russia come into Ukraine? What's the fight back like, and so on.
So my impression on the financial markets is that in the way they respond to the Russian-Ukrainian war is that they overreact to the news and underreact to the trends.
Okay.
Somehow it's not surprising because people don't understand the context, and so it's very difficult to see the trends. And the trends are quite different from what your typical averaging out or what the past wars or different wars would be. So people base their predictions on, or their responses and decisions, market decisions on what they can grasp from the experience from the past history. And I think things are somewhat different here. It's a structurally different war. There's at least 3 economic, truly strategic weapons being used by Russia. One is, we have seen it, it's energy. And we see how these political discussions and wartime discussions about embargo are affecting the decisions on trade, and they will trickle down into the cost structure and supply chain disruptions later. The second one is, there's been a little bit of discussion about it, but people are not really, in my view, thinking about it yet quite clearly, not enough attention has been paid to it. It's food security, because Russia and Ukraine are critical for food security in Northern Africa, in Middle East and some of the Asian countries. And so any food security disruption or problems will polarize and create political destabilization in these countries, which will further create uncertainty in the markets. And the third one, almost no one is talking about, the Northern China to Europe trade is still going through railroads controlled by Russia mostly, and then through the Baltics, Ukraine, and of course not going now, So there's additional disruption there in logistics in this region through the Central Europe. So this is in terms of what it might mean for the economy in the longer run. In terms of the war, we're in the second phase of the war. The first phase was the Battle of Kyiv. This is where Russia was trying to attack from all directions and was trying to grab as much as possible, from Odessa to Kherson to Mariupol to Donetsk, Lugansk, to Kharkiv and to Kyiv. But the grand prize was Kyiv. And it made some progress somewhere like in Kherson or Mariupol, and it failed in Odessa and Kharkiv. But then it truly failed in Kyiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv in the northern part of Ukraine. And that's a big deal, but it's only the first part. Then they repositioned the troops, and they have been trying from, maybe the different people say different, put different dates. Someone is saying 18th or 20th of April. They have started pushing, trying to encircle the Ukrainian troops in the east of Ukraine, but they have not been successful. And Ukrainian troops have been able to push back in the north, in Kharkiv, and in the south. They're challenging certain areas in Kherson region. That slows down supply lines, distracts Russian military resources, and also makes it difficult or impossible the original plan of encircling the Ukrainian troops. So, there are still plans to probably, or attempts to encircle at a smaller scale, but it's a really slow progressing battle. And there is this important date, May 9. For Russia, it's the victory day of the World War II. There's all this rhetoric about denazification, completely baseless story about as if there were some Nazis in Ukraine, even though Russia is actually behaving more like Nazis now rather than Ukraine. But that was an important date. That is an important date, and everyone was, in Russia was looking forward to some kind of decisive victory by May 9, because this war is as much the war of symbols as the kinetic warfare. And so this is not happening. And if it's not happening, there's no clear symbolic point. And I think we are looking at a very long summer in the east of Ukraine, where there'll be a lot of brutality, a lot of slow developments, and something is gonna give. Either it's going to be the Russian troops, and that will trigger a major Russian political crisis internally, or it's going to be that Ukraine will lose the territory, and then there will be some kind of separation of Ukraine. But I don't think the latter separation of Ukraine or splitting is actually feasible. You know, Russia would have to destroy a lot of people and a lot of territory, and it will take much longer than several months for this to happen. You know, so even if they are successful somewhere like in Mariupol, or they get much more progress, you know, tens of kilometers or 50 kilometers in certain areas in the east of Ukraine, that doesn't mean anything, in a sense that Ukraine will fight, the West and the world will supply, and it will continue. So I think what people are making a mistake in terms of expecting implicitly or not being pretty open about it, that we are looking at months, if not years, of prolonged warfare, and it's not going to be resolved diplomatically. It's going to be resolved through the field. Unfortunately for everyone, it's really unnecessary war, and we tried that before as humankind. We know these wars don't work. They don't help. They don't resolve anything. You have to go back to diplomatic solutions, and you can destroy nations. You cannot just announce that Ukraine is not a nation and I'm going to capture it. No, you know, whatever you like or don't like, you know, that's a sovereign nation. You have to keep the territorial integrity of this nation, and you have to work through diplomacy. And Ukraine is getting emboldened. Well, it has always been, but you know, Ukraine is expecting that it will gain its pre-February 24 territory back at this point. So we should understand that the fact that Russia hasn't been able to capture Ukraine within 3 days or a week, as many people wrongly predicted.
And on that 3 days thing, you know, at a naive level, people look at Russia, huge military, nuclear weapons. They were, you know, they had a Cold War with the US, where the two biggest armies were like lined up against each other. So one can understand, at least from a naive perspective, why people expected Russia to win very easily. And so why didn't they win so easily? I mean, surely they've got huge amounts of military. They could just roll into Ukraine and just take over the whole country.
So that was the expectation. That's the same point I was making earlier when I was saying people are trying to average over the past experience, which is not relevant. You know, Russia today and Russian military today, it's not even the Soviet Union of the 80s when the Soviet Union was collapsing. It's not even close. You know, there's some posturing around it, but you see, they cannot get their tanks to move. They cannot resupply their troops. This is, you know, their discipline and their training is subpar. It's not a major military anymore. Yeah, there is brutality and they're willing to sacrifice people, and there are a lot of people, but it's truly, truly very mediocre. And I think people should have studied Ukraine rather than Russia to try to understand what's going to happen. I think there's also an element of this West-splaining or Russia-splaining, you know, like kind of when we only focus on Russia versus the West, living out of the picture the Ukrainian people. And, you know, first of all, there are 140 million people in Russia and there are 40 million people in Ukraine. So it's not a small country. Even compared to Russia, if we mobilize, and we have much higher stake to survive than they do to attack us. So we can mobilize millions of people, several millions of people. For them, it would be a major deal to mobilize several million of people. Furthermore, if you look at the history in World War II, you know, Russia, we're thinking about Russia as the Soviet Union, but Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, and Ukraine military and military capacity there was the part. And even if we look at World War II, a lot of decisive battles were fought in Ukraine, with Ukrainian people being on the side of the Soviet Union against the Germans, against the Nazis. So in that sense, it's somehow Russia has managed to capture the Soviet Union legacy, but it's only one of the republics. And they're not sending mostly people from Moscow. They're sending people from remote and sometimes very poor area. So they're behaving as a colonial power. What they're doing is they're sitting in Moscow and they're robbing people, let's say in Siberia, of the taxes they should pay for gas and oil that they develop there. So people are truly poor there. The wealth gets accumulated in Moscow. And then they recruit those people, put them in tanks and send to die in Ukraine fighting another nation. So it's really, and then later they capture some of the areas in Ukraine like Lugansk and Donetsk, and then mobilize people there who before 2014 were Ukrainians, and now they send them to fight against Ukrainians. So this is, this is really a colonial behavior. It's like Romans did, or, Alexander the Great. They would conquer an area and then force those people fight the next area. That's what they are doing. This is pretty outdated. It's pretty kind of brutal, of course, but it's not working in the modern world. So in that sense, I think anyone who paid any attention to what was really happening with the history of these places would understand that Russia is probably gonna, it's like the beginning of the end for Russia when they decided to attack Ukraine full scale.
And in terms of the Ukrainian side, what is the state of the Ukrainian military, before this war, and obviously before 2014 and since 2014, one could say, since the initial attack from Russia?
So we can look at the history. In 2014, Crimea was annexed, and there was not a single shot fired by the Ukrainian military. And at that time, just before that, the government which fell was very pro-Russian. Yeah. So there was corruption was widespread, the military was weak, morale was not there, there was no ideology. And so Russia attacked. And then in 2014, right after the annexation, they annexed Crimea in the spring. And then in the summer, they moved on Donetsk and Lugansk. And I remember videos where people were stopping troops, they were stopping, Ukrainian people were stopping troops because you shouldn't be fighting anyone, it's like Russian brothers and something. The attitude completely changed, You've seen now videos where Ukrainian people in like Russian speaking Ukrainian in very eastern regions, they come out and again in demonstrations, in protests against Russian occupying troops, risking their lives. You've seen that in Kherson, you've seen that in Melitopol, you've seen that elsewhere. So the attitude, the public attitude, the citizen attitude has changed dramatically over the last 8 years. Now, in terms of military, there were two decisive battles, Debaltseve and Ilovaisk, after which we lost there in 2015, 2016, in those years, in the east of Ukraine. A lot of people, a lot of military died. And but by today's standards or today's scale, this was very minor. There was like a tank battalion coming from Russia, destroying our battalions, having a humanitarian corridor, 300 military being evacuated, all being shot at by Russians and killed, or losing 100 people or 200 people in the Donetsk airport. So this is all, by today's measures, where we're talking about thousands of people and sometimes tens of thousands losses on Russian losses, and we don't reveal the Ukrainian losses, they're not public. But losses are substantive on both sides. That was just, a little episode. But then at that time, Russia was able to secure two decisive battles with essentially one or two battalion tactical groups. Now they have 100 and they couldn't take Kyiv. So that answers the question how much the Ukrainian military evolved. They have 50 times more troops today, and they cannot secure any decisive battle in Ukraine. So in that sense, it's a very different military, it's a different world. And, if they scaled up their attack capacity 50 times since 2014, and they cannot do much with that, they probably need to scale it up another 10 times, and they don't have that resource. So in that sense, they are stuck. Strategically, they have lost because they have demonstrated to the world and to Ukraine their weakness, and domestically. Now they are scrambling to find a way out, and their strategy is to double down, which is an okay strategy if if it is a strategy, and not a sign of desperation. But it looks like it's just a typical dictatorship move where, I'm going to be stubborn, and you know how it ends. these dictatorships implode at a high cost for everyone, for Russians, for Ukrainians, for the world, but it will implode.
And one thing that, you know, many of us were kind of scratching our heads was about why did Russia start this war? You know, timing wise, it was why now and not back in 2014 did they do the full maneuvers that they're doing now. But if you said even further back, what is Russia's issue with Ukraine? Now, what the Russian perspective is that there was an encroachment of NATO, EU, you know, into Ukraine, which was then on the borders of Russia. So that's a challenge to, you know, Russian security. And then the other thing that Russia has mentioned is how Ukrainians were treating the Russian-speaking population, Eastern Ukrainians, that was in some way they were mistreating a part of the population, and so hence Russia had this need to sort of come in. So in terms of that context, that's the Russian sort of their presented motivation to do these incursions.
So let's discuss these two motivations and then go to the reasons. Okay.
Okay.
So one motivation is with the Russian-speaking people being abused, their rights being abused. So, you know, I'll give you date and then I'll give you an anecdote, or maybe the other way around. I am what they call an ethnic Russian.
Okay.
I'm as ethnic Russian as it gets. Part of my family is from, I'm quarter Lithuanian, quarter Ukrainian, and half Russian ethnically in terms of Soviet Union passports. And I have original Ukrainian roots through those Russians, but they were moved during Stalin times to Siberia, and so we're considered to be Russian. So, we're victims of all of this strategic population design by Stalin. But I'm ethnic Russian they're trying to defend. I switched to Ukrainian. I became extremely pro-Ukrainian in 2004 when they tried to poison our president, our candidate. The people might not remember that, but there was this Yushchenko election and he was poisoned, and against him Yanukovych ran, who then later was ousted in 2014. So they have been trying to put this Yanukovych in power since 2004, even poisoning the opposition candidate who won anyway. So, there is a story behind that. So now we ethnic Russians have nothing to do with Russian need to protect. They don't own Russian language. Russian Federation is not equal Russian language, Russian culture, or Russian history. These are different people and different culture. What Russia is doing has nothing to do with Russian culture. Today, it's not Russian culture, it's some other culture. It's really awful. It's a dark place. It has nothing to do with Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin. It has nothing to do with that. There's nothing written there about, destroying, killing kids, destroying cities, taking land by force. There's nothing, but that's not that culture. They cannot claim the good culture and then deny bad using excuses. They are as responsible for the atrocities which are happening now. So if that's their culture, the war crimes, that's their culture, they are not Russians in the sense that they're trying to portray those great Russia, okay? So that's one point, I think. So, and that's all a false reality constructed. Now, if we look at the data, there's no data supporting any abuse of Russian-speaking people, not any systematic evidence, not anecdotes, not stories. So let's look at the number of people who died, because a part of this Russian abuse story is that, Ukraine has been bombing people in the East.
Yeah.
That's the argument, and we came to protect them. That's actually not true. A lot of people died in 2014, 2015, but that's exactly when Russia invaded the east of Ukraine. At that point, they denied it and said it's a civil war, but later we showed to the world the evidence that these were formal troops, regular troops of Russia, and they still kept saying that it was a civil war, But 2014, 2015, 2016, people were dying. 14,000 people overall died in the areas where there's active military fighting on both sides. And then 2018, 18, 19, 20, 21, almost no people dying there, like 2, 3, 10, 15. This is the numbers, more people die from traffic accidents in Kyiv, on a given day than people were dying from military fighting in the east of Ukraine. So this is absolutely not true that there was anything happening with respect to any kind of population, minority or majority in the east of Ukraine. It's a manufactured conflict by Russia that provided indecisive moments. They provided regular troops to tip the balance of the conflict in the favor of the Russian interests. So that's on the ethnic Russians. And I am an ethnic Russian and I represent them. And I want, I have nothing to do with that Russian Federation, which it has become. That's not Russian culture. Now, the second argument was NATO. But it's not NATO that invaded Georgia. It's not NATO that generated atrocities in Chechnya. It's not NATO that have done anything in Moldova and Transnistria. It's not NATO engaged in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's not NATO in Kazakhstan entering troop, and it's not NATO suppressing protests in Belarus. So there is a pattern of using violence to achieve geopolitical goals. And NATO, there was no support for NATO in Ukraine until 2014. And even then it was controversial how many people were in favor. But of course, after 2022, everyone is supporting joining NATO. So if anything, the opposite is true. NATO didn't want to take Ukraine. Never wanted to take Ukraine. After 2014, after invasion in the eastern Ukraine, Ukraine wanted really badly, at least part of the people, and we put it in our constitution that we want to join NATO. And NATO was not giving us any reasonable, any realistic, any constructive framework to reach them. Not even some form of association or enhanced membership, enhanced partnership, nothing. So in that sense, there's no evidence and there's no reality that NATO has ever been an option for Ukraine. Of course, now everyone, similar to Finland, Sweden, and other non-NATO countries, everyone is running to NATO because, excuse me, you really need protection from Russia.
So what was the underlying motivation of Russia then? I mean, why do they want Ukraine?
I think they are collectors of lands at this point, and they're not thinking in the Western world realities. They're not measuring it in GDP, in wealth, in prosperity, in values, in human rights, in kind of longevity, life expectancy, environmental terms. They're not concerned about this. It's just the land they control. They're collectors of land. And furthermore, I think their logic is really, in a sense, for them, Russian people also don't have agency. Russian people are serfs. They don't have a say. It's the same president. Who cares how they vote? If someone says something against the political elites, they go to prison. Navalny, or they get poisoned, like in London. Or assassinated. So you don't have any say. You shut up. You don't have any agency as the people of Russia. At best, we can let you immigrate, run away if you're not loyal, and you're lucky if you do that. And so, that's their attitude then towards Ukrainians too. It's not a state because they cannot be a state. People don't have any say. They could be elites, but, these are not our elites. So there must be Western elites, or there must be some kind of regime. And if only we take it, we overtake it, we remove it, then things will be good because we will finally get loyal regime to us, like in Belarus. And people would support because people don't have any say. So in their mindset, people are to be controlled.
Yeah. And what about the oligarchs in Russia? Obviously the West has imposed sanctions on the oligarchs. And I wonder, do the oligarchs have any influence on Putin?
I don't think so. So, even in Ukraine, we have the same problem. We have oligarchs, and Putin have put them under much control. And when Zelensky tried to put oligarchs under control, he got a lot of pushback in media and in courts and in economics. So in that sense, we have a similar problem. Oligarchs there, oligarchs here. But it's very clear that oligarchs don't have much say, neither in Ukraine at this point, nor in Russia. They are enablers in Russia of the regime, of course, because that's the model. And I think part of the problem in Ukraine is, and maybe that's partly why they thought that they would be successful, because they thought, this is your political realm too, you run, the system is run partly through oligarchs. Some of these oligarchs feel that they are more powerful than ministers. I've seen that multiple times when an oligarch would perceive, some oligarchs would put themselves above the president. They would say, they would try to discipline the president of Ukraine. It doesn't work with Zelensky. So that's a separate story.
Yeah.
But I think in Russia, oligarchs are disciplined, and anyway, they are kind of a part of the system in which you can steal, you can rob, you can exploit the public, right? That's the same story. How you become an oligarch? Because you kind of steal. I mean, in colloquial language you steal, but in practice you get really cheap assets. You build a monopoly, and then you exploit your monopoly, political and market power, to continue to earn rents at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah.
So that's the same attitude, where you don't respect the people, you don't respect the agency of the people, you don't respect the notion of competition, you don't respect the notion of one person, one vote. You put yourself above the law, you put yourself above the people. And so that's the notion of oligarchy. And then you build around yourself a fortress with media, with captured judges, with paid politicians to maintain the system, to kind of reproduce it. So we have the same problem, but to a much lesser extent. And our public is truly against the oligarchs, have been fighting against the oligarchs all the time. So in essence, it's a very different scenario. I think it's paradoxical why out of the post-Soviet Union republics, I'm not counting the Baltics because they haven't been in the Soviet Union long enough, but Ukraine is the only one which is democracy, plus Moldova. But fundamentally, everything else went back to normal. Oligarchs and the political elites are ruling and oppressing people. That's a very simple model. And whoever disobeys or tries to compete, they either disappear or have problems or get arrested or pushed out, to exile. And you name country after country, that's the story. And Ukraine somehow is different. That's a puzzle. But once you understand that Ukraine is different, then something fundamentally is at play in Ukraine. And so the world and Russia should have been alert to it. That there are, it's not individuals, it's the gravity forces, the fundamental sociological, geopolitical forces at play there in Ukraine. And I think it's a much bigger deal what's happening, because there are truly two models of running the societies at play, the Russian model and the European model. And Ukraine has chosen the European model consciously or subconsciously and has been successful. It's the successful case of the Soviet Union culture, which has become European culture, or maybe has simply been oppressed. And so now it's standing alone, standing sovereign, standing independent. And in that sense, it's threatening. I don't necessarily think that they view it this strategic, from the strategic perspective, but it's definitely annoying for Russia, for the Russian elites, that the Ukrainian president can, put under arrest a pro-Russian oligarch, because it's the right thing to do. And it wouldn't budge at negotiations, and it would demand the sovereignty and integrity, territorial integrity of Ukraine, and, wouldn't submit to Russia. So that is annoying. And from their perspective, it cannot be the people, right? Because if it is the people, then there's a problem. The Russian people can rise. No, that cannot be. So it must be a regime. So let's remove Zelensky. Let's solve the problem. But it's not working like that. It's not Zelensky per se. Zelensky is the leader, but he leads the people.
Yeah. And just coming back to Putin, I'm trying to understand the pressure points on him. So, I mean, do you think he's got a selection of advisors that can influence him? Can China influence him? Or is he just makes his own decisions and he's erratic and he just does whatever he wants?
He's not erratic. He's probably poorly informed, but he is rational in his own way. He has his own rules that we in the West don't want to learn. I'm not saying we should, but I'm saying that in order to understand the enemy, we should understand his logic.
Yeah.
He does have the logic, and this is the logic of force. It's a little bit of medieval or maybe 19th century logic.
I mean, it sounds like he's like, yeah, the medieval colonial empires, you know, say you have a central figure, they get a lot of value from like owning more and more land. They want sort of expansive, you know, their sort of feudal structures or serf structures, sort of different versions, in effect, of de facto slavery of different kinds, you know, kind of that kind of viewpoint. It's like going back 500-600 years or something.
Yes, and so if you want to break through this, it has to be done by force, not negotiations. There's nothing you can order on the table through diplomacy, through trading. You know, whatever you offer me, if I'm stronger than you, I can take it.
I mean, can China influence Russia? I mean, there was a lot of, you know, expectation that China could, you know, bring them to the table and tell them to stop.
Not yet. Russia has to get weaker. China will milk this conflict to its benefit.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think China will come out the real winner here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they are the pivotal player.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
they're not going to play their hand, in my view, frivolously.
Yeah.
So they wait to see who's going to get weaker, and then they will come and try to maybe mediate.
Yeah.
In the interest of the winner, but the rents will have to be paid by the loser. And I think Russia will, in the end, so the tragedy of Russia, it will become dependent on China.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll become a client state of China, ironically. Now you did mention Chechnya in part of our early discussion. Obviously, there were two Chechen Wars, you know, like Russia sort of attacked Chechnya, you know, the first version of it in the 90s, the mid-90s, Russia lost. You know, it took like 3-4 years or something. Are there parallels with what we're seeing now with Ukraine in terms of an expectation, like Russia thought they could just go in and take full control of a province or region, and it just turns out it ends up being this intractable guerrilla warfare where they can't win?
I think that Russia got annoyed by Ukraine becoming ever more ferocious and cocky.
Okay.
So it's a different story. It's not that we need to finish the business. It's like, okay, we kind of, you know, in 1994, we took away the weapons, and so they have to rely on us, you know.
Yeah.
So I think their logic from the Budapest Memorandum is also colonial logic. And they probably don't even think that they betrayed. They said, you know, we guarantee your sovereignty, but we guarantee, as you know, you are a vassal state now. You know, kind of depend. You don't have sovereignty now after Budapest Memorandum. You've given up your weapons. We paid you off, and now there are 4 parties which guarantee your sovereignty. So basically, you are our serf, and the 4 of us decide your fate. And then, you know, there was this Crimea and Black Fleet, and Ukraine has been pushing, you know, for sovereignty. And there is a notion of pseudo sovereignty with Russia. And so that notion stays, that you can do whatever you want, but foreign policy, internal affairs, meaning policing, and military policy is decided or coordinated with the Kremlin. And so we are seeing that right now in Belarus. Belarus is a sovereign, but in fact, pseudo-sovereign state. They don't have a say over their foreign policy. They must side with Russia. They don't have any disagreement with Russia on anything. Not a single disagreement. You know, they are really not controlling their foreign policy. They could have been pro-Russian, but they would have a tweak. You know, no, they don't have any. Now their military policy, you know, they lost sovereignty there. You know, it's a plant, you know, it's an area for resupplying of Russian troops and staging attacks on Ukraine. And then internal policy, the policing of the state, you know, it was also done clearly, you know, brutal Russian style suppression of any opposition. You can say that this is Lukashenko making decisions, but, you know, I think whoever is not in denial would agree that Lukashenko, it was not in his best interest ever to allow the Russian troops to launch air force or attacks, ground attacks, or missiles from Belarusian territory. So, you know, that's not his decision. He didn't make it. So he doesn't have a say there. So he lost sovereignty in these areas. So that's the notion of pseudo sovereignty. I think that was expectation of about Ukraine, and Yanukovych did that. And if you remember 2014, what was the trigger for the conflict, where Yanukovych said, "Oh, we're not going to have an association agreement with the EU. We're gonna stick with Russia." Russia's position was, you don't get closer, you don't have an association agreement with the EU. So that was also a pseudo sovereignty concept, that your foreign policy have to be approved by the Kremlin, and the people disagreed with the president in Ukraine. And that's why we had protests in 2013 and 2014. And that's when Russia went in to take Crimea and engage in the East to punish Ukraine for daring to run an independent foreign policy. So if you take a perspective of pseudo-sovereignty, the way Russia looks at Ukraine is that Russia is a betrayer. It betrayed Russia by violating the rules of pseudo-sovereignty.
Okay.
That it doesn't view it in the way that there's some sovereign nation, the people, and they have the right for self-determination. No, they never had the right. In 1996, so we signed the Budapest Memorandum. So you have to, now your fate depends on the countries, including Russia. Russia has the right of veto over what you do. But we do disagree with that. That's not the deal from our perspective. So I think this is the culture clash of visions of the Western world and the Russian world. And the Western world didn't want, some of people don't want even today to understand and admit that Russia live according to a different cultural code.
And you mentioned the West, and let's focus a bit more on the Western response. So, we have the US, which has been fairly aggressive, but for me, what's more intriguing is Germany and Europe. So there's been some sanctions, obviously, on certain assets and markets, central bank reserves. But the key thing is that Europe, notably Germany, are reluctant to shut off the import of Russian gas. So if you don't shut off Russian imports from Russia, then Russia still has lots of revenue coming in. So what's your thought on the European response to the war?
So Ukraine also did not diversify away from Russia until the war started in 2014. After 2014, we diversify. So it's delay of the real politics.
Yeah,
it's really costly for politicians to you really have to change politicians to change the policies.
Okay.
You cannot convince politicians to change their policies. They come with certain policies, and it has always been an easy policy to get cheap gas or lower what really gets me about Germany. Germany is so prudent that I don't know if it's the case now, but when I was in Germany as a postdoc, as a junior professor, you really have to have, I think, either, I don't remember, insurance on your dog or insurance on your bike. You really have alles muss in Ordnung sein. Everything has to be according to the rules. Everything has to be prudent, extremely prudent. If something goes wrong, no, we can't afford this. And how is this culture allows to get itself so dependent on one country?
Yeah.
Where you require insurance from, for a bike or for a dog, and yet you're completely dependent on one country. Your industry is dependent on this. So this is, I don't understand. This is really, really a big scandal. It's a strategic loss of general. Maybe there is corruption, maybe there is compromise. Remember, Putin understands Germany very well, because the beginning of his career he spent in Eastern Germany. So he as a KGB officer, that's where the beginning of his career was. So he knows the culture, he understands the culture. In that sense, he socially designed the hack to Germany. Should we blame Germany? Probably we should, because national security trumps the economic security. Yep. At least according to the Western values, well, if we value freedom above prosperity, right? But the problem is, if you don't value freedom, you won't have prosperity either. I mean, we know that, and it's trivial kind of, but that's what's going to happen anyway. So we did the same. We used to have cheap gas from Russia, and we had pro-Russian presidents. Did it help us? No, This is a false promise that if you are nice to Russia, they will somehow be nice to you. You know, we have been nice to Russia. Many of our presidents, first president, second president, third president, they were all very friendly to Russia. And we were getting cheap gas, we were getting good deals, we were getting investment. The moment we dared to do something differently, Russia came down on us with all its wrath. And so it is going to do to other countries which are somehow in, you know, I think, living in a fantasy world that you can benefit from cheap gas from Russia. You're not going to benefit. The price will be higher. So what Germany has to do now is to diversify and build infrastructure to become independent or less dependent on Russian gas, and talk to Russia from the position of strength, meaning that they have outside options and they don't have to rely on Russia, not from the position of weakness.
Now, Germany has talked about this diversification, but it's going to, in their view, it will take a number of years for that to happen. So, you know, Germany is being prudent in its own way, but by doing so, it's also, I suppose, helping Russia right now. So from a timing perspective, I mean, Germany has stated they do want to diversify away from Russia, but it's really a question of timing. You know, do you do it? Do you immediately cut Russia off now, or do you say, okay, it's a multi-year transition program?
You know, I'll give you a Ukrainian perspective, and of course, Germans will not like it, but you know, this is the truth. You know, whether we like it or not. Okay, so the EU overall paid something like 50 to 60 billion euros to Russia. And for that money, Russia has imposed, and I'm not counting death and suffering, just around 100 billion direct damages on Ukraine. So that's a good investment, you know, it's doubling, you know, they create double the damage for what you are paying. Or you can count it the other way around. You can say, okay, they have paid 60 billion to Russia, the EU altogether. And Ukraine is asking for support of 20, 30, 40 billion dollars and is not yet receiving. You know, there are some commitments, but the commitments are half of that or a third of what's needed. And it's definitely much less than what has been paid to Russia. And finally, you can also make an kind of opportunity cost calculation. You know, okay, you're gonna lose 5% of GDP. That's, I think, as large as the estimates have.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're gonna lose 2% of GDP. Okay. So how much is it per person? You know, per capita? We're gonna talk about, you know, I'm just gonna round out, even if it were 100,000 euros, you know, we're gonna talk about 2,000 euros per person, right?
Yeah.
3,000 euros a person. So how much is human life in Ukraine worth? So you know, we've probably lost tens of thousands in Mariupol. You know, we just need to be honest that, you know, we're not willing to pay 2,000 euros a year, which is 200 per. It's okay that people die. Okay, fine. You know, we're fine. You know, that's fine. Let's just be honest about it.
That's very sobering thoughts, words there. Now, to round off this discussion, earlier you had mentioned three of the kind of the weapons Russia has. You know, there's energy, there was food, but you also mentioned a third one, which was the logistical trade routes, especially between China and Europe. Can you talk a bit more about that source of leverage that Russia has? Because I haven't heard many people talking about that.
Yeah, almost no one is talking about it. Some of the northern China, not everything is shipped through the sea, although most shipped through the sea, but it's still some which is being shipped through the railroads. And if you destabilize, and I mean, if Russia can control the degree of destabilization in the region from the Baltics to Turkey, which it currently does,
yeah,
then it is in the driver's seat on how expensive and how reliable these routes are. So it can actually destabilize the economy of the EU, not only through energy, but also through other supplies.
Okay, yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. Well, I mean, I'm sure we could talk more about the conflict, but I did want to kind of move away and also talk about something a bit more, not kind of just different, so that we don't stay on that just that one topic. I did notice looking through your research and everything, I stumbled across an interesting blog you wrote, which was 5 types of behaviors that can help you get to the future. So it was almost kind of like advice. I imagine this must be for your students or something. But yeah, I mean, can you talk a bit about what those 5 behavior types are?
You caught me off guard. I have forgotten the 5 types, frankly. Yeah, I remember writing a blog, and it was targeted towards the Ukrainian culture. And I was trying to refocus people away from the zero-sum game towards the constructive creation, where people have to focusing on something positive. Yeah, you're looking up probably the blog.
Yeah. I'm just going to quickly look it up.
Let me do that too.
Yeah. But I thought it was we can edit this back in, by the way.
Yeah.
So, it's funny when I go to websites in Ukraine, in London, there's an additional. It takes longer to load websites. There must be some firewall checks or something.
Yes. We put it. Otherwise, we are under attack. So I have this blog in front of me, and I'm gonna. But yes, the website is checking me too.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll pull it up as well, and then once you see it, then I'll ask you the question again. Okay. Yeah, I see it. So yeah.
Yes. Good.
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you again. I'll sort of come back in again. So Timothy, we've talked a lot about the war and the conflict, and I do want to talk about other things as well. And I was looking at your research, and I stumbled across a blog I think you must have written for your students or for your audience that you have, entitled 5 types of behaviors that can help get you to the future. So can you tell us about why you wrote that and why you have that on your homepage?
Yeah, it's good that you bring it up. I'm looking at it right now, and in some sense it aged well, because it says, rule number 1 is do not be afraid. And here's the phrase: the people in Ukraine often do not believe that they can become successful, invent a new top world product, or build a new mega corporation. If a person doesn't believe that he will succeed, he has already lost in the race called competition of humans in the 21st century. However, new inventions, new business practices, successful startups are created by people like you and me. They're essentially genetically identical to us. Perhaps they have had better education or have more resources, but success requires just one idea during the entire life. The key to success is how you implement this idea. It has to be done very well. And I think, if I look at this from the perspective of the war now, it's about agency and sovereignty of individuals. We can say, Ukrainians can win this war. These wars are won by people who are more committed. It's not given that Russia is stronger. Don't be afraid of Russia. I think the entire world is afraid of Russia.
Yeah.
And here we say, do not be afraid of Russia. Do not be afraid of Russia. Actually, let's do this exercise. I'm going to reinvent or reapply of these 5 rules for the West. Do not be afraid. So I will say, do not be afraid of Russia. Russia is just like us and maybe inferior in so many ways. Then the second one, be ethical. Integrity and values are critical. This is what's going to, don't become, in an attempt to become successful, do not become unethical. Because success requires support and resources provided by others, but without trust, there will be no help. And let's apply it to our discussion earlier about Germany. Do not put the immediate economic benefit above the human values of life, because that's going to, in the longer run, destroy the standing of Germany in the Western world. And that's going to hurt Germany more. Then be patient. Be patient. Be patient means that the war is, here it says success is a marathon. Here we say the war is a marathon. You need to win, but it's going to take time, and you cannot do it overnight. You can't win over Russia overnight. It's going to be a series of small steps that brings you ahead of Russia. Many of these steps will be failures, but this is normal. And this I'm just reading from the blog, but applying it. And then specialize and become the best. So everyone, whoever is now fighting, you have to be the best in something. If all of us want to win the war, then we have to specialize. I'm good at fundraising. You're good at supply chains. Someone is good at shooting. Someone is good at intelligence. We all have to be, and build a public profile. Here it means, have a reputation, be accountable, be transparent. And I think these are the 5 rules which apply to the governments and apply to individuals to be successful in today's world. So yeah,
so they're great. They're great 5 points actually, and you're right. They could apply equally to us in the West, and whether are we sticking to what the values we say we have and our ethics, are we scared, and the patience on. I mean, it's really good. I'll include a link to this in our show notes as well. Now, I do like reading books as well, and so I always ask my guests books that they like or have influenced them. Do you have any books that you sort of cite as influential for you?
So the one book which influenced me a lot is probably one of the most, it's probably the most influential, is Strategy of Conflict by Thomas Schelling. He worked in the State Department during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He developed the notion of strategic deterrence, and I truly subscribe to that, the ideas of commitment and threats out of equilibrium. And I think a lot of people don't understand it. You really, here, you have to be strong so that, you can't respond to Russia by weakness. You cannot be afraid to escalate. It's just the opposite. If you commit to escalate, then you're going to be able to de-escalate, because then Russia knows that if they do another step, then the consequences for them would be worse. If I think Biden was making this mistake in the beginning of the war. The administration of Biden was saying, we're going to put sanctions in, but we don't know which one. We're not going to tell you. So of course it's an invitation to be tested.
Yeah.
You really have to say, if you're going to do A, they're going to be B, and B is much worse than A. So I think that's one book which has been extremely useful for me. And then in politics, I think I love the book Save the Cat by Snyder. This is the book for drama, for script writers for Hollywood. It explains what should be a proper movie script. And I think politics today is about movies. It has to be a movie that everyone wants to watch, because those politicians who control the narrative, they will win. But to control the narrative, you need to attract attention. And to attract attention and maintain attention, focus on you have to be dramatic. So you have to behave you have to script the narrative, political narrative, in a drama way. So once I've read that book, it became much easier for me to understand Zelensky, to understand Boris Johnson, to even understand Trump.
Yeah.
So it kind of opened up to me a different angle of design, of emotion and perception. So I think that's the second book I would recommend reading. And
And you mentioned Zelensky, and I haven't actually asked you this, and I should ask you, what's it like? What's your views of him? I mean, you obviously have interacted with him as an advisor and so on. Any thoughts on his leadership style and his his psychology?
It's kind of a startup style. It's a group of creative people who decide what to do and come up with unusual decisions and are not afraid to test anything. This is really appealing. And he's also very likable as a person. He's an outsider. And so for me as an economist, sometimes it is frustrating because he doesn't accept my usual supply-demand mesh arguments, or so he thinks very differently. But I think he's very charismatic, comes across as a person to be liked, and he's not afraid to lead in a very creative ways.
Yeah. Now, the final thing I wanted to ask was, obviously, you're involved in lots of humanitarian efforts. So if people did want to, people in the West or people who listen to this podcast, which is people all over the world, if they did want to provide some support to the various humanitarian, causes in Ukraine, what's the best way for them to do that?
So, please go to our page or to my Twitter, and I have a pinned tweet with a link to our foundation.
Okay, I'll add a link as well.
Yeah. And, you know, there are several foundations. There's the government accounts in the National Bank of Ukraine. There's Come Back Alive, which is military foundation. I wouldn't recommend any international organizations because their overheads and their speed of decision making is really, you know, they deliver things by the time they are not needed, you know, and so that's really out of. I think it makes everyone feel good to donate to the Red Cross at the counter. But I'm not sure it is rich, you know, it's being used effectively. So I would say find the Ukrainian NGO, and make sure that they satisfy certain principles. And these are the principles I'm thinking about. One is the bottleneck is money. So in other ways, they know what they are doing, and they know how to source things, how to deliver them. Everything is done. They just need money. So your dollar, your pound, your euro will matter. So second one is they're delivering it to where it's needed. Most likely it's front lines or recently liberated areas, or depending on your cause, it could be, you know, shelters of refugees in Poland, but it depends on what your cause is, you know, but they are in the cause, they are operating there. Exactly. It's not some agents. They keep low inventories, meaning that they don't sit on stuff. And they are formal. Formal meaning the money is collected in a formal way. And finally, the governance is clear. They have boards and they have some history. So you need to get someone who's it's almost contradictory, because usually you have one or the other. You either have guys who operate with zero overheads on the ground, but then it's total mess because they're not institutionalized, or you have institutionalized organizations. They take 50% of overhead and take 2 months to make a decision. Find those which are both, you know, they're institutionalized, and they make quick decisions, and they work with the end user. And we are one of them, but there are others.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's great to know that there are organizations that can put the money to good use. So with that, I mean, thanks a lot for coming on as a guest. Obviously, it's a very tragic sort of backdrop. Hopefully, when we next connect, things have eased up in a way that's beneficial to people on the ground ultimately. And yeah, let's stay in touch. And I urge people to go to the sites that Tymofiy sort of recommended, and do indeed sort of follow what's going on in the conflict and provide whatever support people can.
Thank you.
Great.